Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. Today we are piecing this beautiful crown of scraps block and I promise you will feel like a queen or king after piecing it because it is super scrappy and so much fun. So let's jump on the machine and begin piecing this together. So the starting point of your crown of scraps block is this arrangement, and I've already gone ahead and pieced 2 half square triangles together like this, and that is going to form one row. And then we've also got more half square triangles and fabric A squares in the corners. And in case you're needing a reminder on how to make half square triangles, I have another tutorial on how to piece that unit, so definitely check that out. Okay, to get this center block ready to go, all we've got to do is flip over these pieces and place a clip. Because of course, I don't know about you, but I can take this over to my machine and I'll get all flipped around and I won't know what's being pieced to what, and I'll probably end up doing something like that, which will be all wrong. So here we go. On these rows, the best thing to do is flip over, place a clip, and just be really careful. As you flip over, make sure that you're always going basically kind of in the same direction. In this case, I'm always going from right to left, so that way I'm sure that those pieces are going together properly. It can get really confusing, I found, if you start, sometimes flipping it that way, sometimes flipping it that way. There's just so many ways to make mistakes with that. The clip is just simply to hold the pieces in place and to remind me what seam I'm stitching. So in this case, I place the clip like this, and that is perpendicular to the seam I'm going to stitch. And so when I get to the machine, there's no question I'm not going to try and stitch this to that edge or something like that. I know exactly what I'm doing next. Okay, so now let's take this to the machine. We're going to stitch these pieces together. So I am sewing on the Eversewn Sparrow 20, and you can come and check out this machine at leahday.com/sew20. And I have set to 01, that is my straight stitch with the needle in the center position. And I have changed my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters, and this is going to produce a nice, tight, secure stitch. So I want to take out that first clip, and I always take a look at my pieces, and especially when working with half square triangles, I look for that extra seam allowance. Now, if this was flipped around this way, then I would probably rotate it so that way I could lead with the seam allowance first. And I do it that way because that's extra bulky, and when your foot hits it and it's at the end of the seam, it can oftentimes push the fabrics downward. So here we go. I'm leading with that bulky seam allowance. I have my needle in the down position. That's exactly where I want it. So I can lift the foot with my presser foot lifter and slide the fabrics right up against that needle. And that's putting it in jail, so it doesn't have anywhere else it can go. And the fabrics aren't going to slip. They're going to stay perfectly in position. There we go. Now I'll grab my next set of fabrics. This is the longer set. But that's no problem. Now the piece in the center is just a plain black square of fabric or background square of fabric, and that doesn't have any seam allowances on it. So obviously I want that face down on my sewing machine, and I want the seam allowances face up so I can see them. Now it also helps a lot that I have a queen size Supreme slider here positioned over my machine bed. And I do that because it's a slippery Teflon sheet. This is actually intended for free motion quilting, but I set it up here because it's like a slip and slide. It helps me slip the pieces in. And if I had seam allowances on the back, I find that this really helps to stop the seam allowances from slipping and turning over the wrong way. Okay, so once I get my needle in it, I like to take a look and check in and make sure that the corners of those 2 pieces are coming out just exactly right. And then also that the fabrics are staying in alignment all the way down that side too. Now, of course, piecing black background fabric triangles to black background fabric square, I can't really see very well, so I'm just hoping that those edges are staying in nice alignment. Okay, I'll grab my last row. And here's a great situation of, right here I have no extra seam allowance. On this other edge I do. I'm going to flip this around so that way I can piece it so the seam allowance is going first. That's just a small tip, but it can make a big difference. If your fabrics are slipping and sliding, and you're ending up with, you know, a piece that's even 1/8 of an inch longer than the other. That can definitely throw off your piecing. And definitely in a patchwork block like Crown of Scraps, we got a lot of things going on with this block, and we want to be really cautious and careful as we piece all the units. Okay, so in between piecing and doing this chain piecing, I grab a scrap charger. This is just 2 layers of fabric. I double up, and I stitch through this just to keep my machine in stitching mode. And what that does is it reduces the bobbin thread waste. You're using less bobbin thread. You don't have those long thread tails. It reduces the chance that your machine's gonna gag and then you're gonna have to rethread it. And what is also awesome, it lifts your foot up just a little bit at the perfect height for piecing. So, you know, it just kind of keeps everything going smoothly. I really think it saves time. So as you can see, I'm now ready to start my second set of seams. I'm just lining things up. I'm making sure, you know, with every set of pieces that I grab, I make sure I take my time to make sure that right edge and the top edge are in nice alignment. And sometimes when I pick up and hold that, you know, when I'm matching up black fabric, it's just very hard to see. But if I pick it up and hold it close to my face, I can see that those edges are lining up nicely, and that's just right. So now I'll lift my foot, slide those pieces right up against the needle, and stitch on down. So I'm gonna keep working on this, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready for the next step. So here is our center square pieced together, and I basically just took those rows, made sure to match those seams, top and bottom, and that came together really nicely. Now, the second thing you want to piece is some half square triangles and some scrappy squares together to make this Pachi Rectangle. And you're going to make 4 of those, and those are going to be the sides. Those are going to go right around that center square, just like so. And I did start getting just a little obsessive about my yellows. I ended up with a lot of really eye-catching yellows in this block, but as I've said many, many times before, kind of the hardest thing to work with scraps is to start getting too obsessive with the colors, so be really careful about that. Okay, so now that it's laid out and I'm sure it's correct, I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip the piece over, place a clip, flip the piece over and place a clip. So that's ready to go and stitch. And I'm going to go on ahead and piece these pieces together, and then I'll meet you back here when we're piecing the rows so I can give you some tips on matching those seams. So here are the rows pieced together, and the most important seam to match when you're bringing those together to form the center block is this seam right here. That's going to be the most visually, you know, kind of jarring if that seam slips. So because of that, I'm going to flip this over and place a clip in those spots. And that's just going to help me remember when I get to my machine to really pay attention to those spots in particular. And another seam that might help just to make sure that that seam lines up is the center seam. If that one lines up and my piecing and my cutting has been accurate, then that seam should match up too. So that's what I'm going to clip, and then let's take it to the machine and sew it together. So here we're at the machine, and I'm lining up that right edge and top edge of these pieces so they're in perfect alignment. And I gotta watch out, I've got seam allowances on both sides here. I wanna make sure that those aren't going to flip over. And yes, I do think it's perfectly fine to press your seam allowances open and flat. I do that because it just makes the block so much easier to quilt over. So much flatter, and it makes the block piece more accurately too. So here we go. Now I want to make sure that this seam matches perfectly. So I'm going to pull back on it and double check it, and that seam line's lining up just so. And I'm just putting some fingertip pressure on it as I guide it into the machine. There we go. So with that seam matched, now this one should be no trouble. And you know, while I'd like that seam to match there too, I'm kind of just trusting my piecing, I'm trusting my fabric preparation, which I always pre-wash, starch, and press my fabric before cutting. I'm also trusting my cutting, that it was accurate. You know, because if you start out with pieces that aren't cut the same sizes, you know, these squares in particular, if they're not cut the same sizes, it's really not gonna work. But that's the thing. If you're sure that everything is cut the right size, and that comes from good fabric preparation, it was easy to cut. It was, it was easy to cut accurately because the fabric was stiff and stable and not likely to wiggle out of shape. Well, then everything comes together really easily, even with those seams pressed open. You can see here, I'm not pinning, I'm just mashing the two seams right on top of one another and then guiding that through the machine and letting the machine stitch it together. I also am careful to keep the fabrics along the edge of that 1/4 inch patchwork foot, and that is a foot that you can find at leahday.com. I really like that particular 1/4 inch patchwork foot because you get a 1/4 inch to both sides, and that's extra useful when you're doing techniques like Quilt-As-You-Go. When I I stitch to both sides of the foot, so that's something really useful too. Okay, I'm coming down here on the very, very end. Just want to make sure that we end on the right track too. There we go. So I'm going to do the exact same thing when I'm stitching on the other side. And then here's what it looked like when I finished stitching the center of our Crown of Scraps block. So I talked a lot about seams pressed open there, and I want to show you real quick how to press your seams open properly, because the absolute wrong way to do it is to take your iron and try and stick in the tip and kind of gouge at the fabric to flatten it out. Number one, that doesn't work. It ends up messing up your fabric. It really kind of stretches and skews it. You put a lot more pressure down with the tip of your iron when you do it that way too, and it doesn't result in the seam being really nice and flat. So here's how you do it properly. You want to finger press the seam open first, and I actually use my thumbnail or my fingernail and drag it across the seam to flatten it out completely. And you actually can hear that. There you go. You can hear that because I'm really putting some pressure against it. And then you take your iron, and this is a hot, dry iron, no water in it. I have it set to the cotton setting, and I like it to be dry because steam is really useful. It's good for techniques where I want the fabric to go wiggly wobbly. If I wanted to steam this and stretch it into a different shape, then steam is extremely useful for that. But when I want the fabric to stay stiff and stable and square and not stretched out of shape, then obviously I'm not going to use steam. And steam also tends to soften up starch, which I don't want that to happen either. I want the block to stay stiff and stable until after it has been quilted, until I am sure that I no longer need the fabric to be stiff and stable. So that is how I press those seam allowances open. And, this was one of those things that took me a few years to learn and master. I was one of those girls that grabbed the iron and tried to gouge at it with the tip of the iron. And I struggled with that. And then I also a lot of times I tried to press my seam allowances to one side. But it only took 1 or 2 quilts before I realized, wow, it's really tough. If I have all those seam allowances pressed to one side, that can be an extra 4 layers of fabric in that one little pocket right there. And when my needle would hit that when I quilted, it would break a needle, quite honestly. So this is one of those opinionated kind of things. Some people really hate to press seam allowances open. So if you have a method that you already like to press your seams to one side, I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. But I oftentimes hear from people who think that pressing seams open like this is the wrong thing to do. And they have learned, possibly from a hand quilting instructor, that pressing seams open weakens the seam. Well, that was true when you were hand stitching the pieces together, but we stitch this together with a machine with a 1.5 millimeter stitch length. That's really the key. Because I lower my stitch length and it's super, super tight and stable, I feel like that allows me to press those seam allowances open and have absolutely no problem with it. So there we go. That is the center of our pretty Crown of Scraps block. And now let's talk about the borders. And the borders involve these beautiful hourglass squares. And you can find another tutorial on how to piece these. So definitely check that out if you need some help. And these are going to line up to the top and bottom of the block, just like so. And the longer borders have just a square of background fabric in both corners. So there we go. You're just going to piece that on, and then attach your outermost borders, and here's what it looks like whenever you finish your Crown of Scraps block. So that's it for this video. If you'd like to find more patterns for the Friendship Sampler Quilt Along, come and check them out at leahday.com/friendship. Yes, you can join in the fun anytime and work at your own pace. All of these videos and tutorials that I've shared will be up forever, as well as the quilt patterns, so you can work and make this quilt anytime, even if that's far beyond this year. So come and check it out and join in the fun at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.